Thank you very much. It's great to be here. My name is Jan Willem Bode. I'm a partner with Guidehouse. Guidehouse is a consulting firm, and we've got a motto strapline, which is called Outwit Complexity. And when this strapline was introduced, probably about a year ago or so, I actually read it and reread it, and actually realized that that is exactly what we've been doing for the last 20 years when we've been working around climate change. Climate change, investing in infrastructure, building back better, building back greener, and all those kind of things. All of them are complex problems for which there is no easy answer. So what we're trying to do is really try to outwit that complexity that's being thrown at us. And if you look at building back, building infrastructure, within a context of decarbonization, within a context of climate change, within a context of science-based targets and net zero, etc., it's definitely up there with the most complex problems that you can possibly imagine. It's exciting to be here in person. It's exciting to see so many people talking about science-based targets. I really appreciate the shout out by Jim Andrews from PepsiCo about SLOC, the program that we designed, and is a key example of how we actually outwit the complexity on how you deal with your suppliers, how you deal with your Scope 3. So it's great to actually see that. When talking about infrastructure, we're actually at a real tipping point at this moment in time, because investing in infrastructure, upgrading infrastructure, building back is actually an opportunity. Because what we see is that infrastructure that's been rebuilt, whether it is transport systems, whether it's energy systems, whether it is social housing, etc., we actually end up with a more resilient system, with a more resilient environment, and actually with a cheaper environment as well. Because what we see right now is that decarbonization, resiliency, and costs go hand in hand. And that it literally is, that tipping point has only been achieved maybe 12 months ago. So when we talk about there is hope, yes, there's definitely hope, because actually what we see is exactly that. The only problem is that it's only an opportunity if we do this faster, smarter, and greener than we've done it in the past. Faster, why? Because so many things are changing around us, and at such a speed that we've never seen before. We see volatility in commodity prices, whether it's energy, etc., which is amplified by what's happening in the Ukraine, but that is nothing other than just an amplification of a trend we were seeing anyway. So we need to do this faster. We need to do smarter. Why do we need smarter? Because otherwise we just get incremental change, and we need to have step change in order to get this done. And we need to do it greener. Why do we need it greener? Because you end up with cheaper, more resilient systems. And that is the biggest challenge that there is. There's a couple of things that are actually really positive. One is that technology is not a problem. We have all the technologies we need to hit net zero targets for most, if not all, of the companies or organizations that have signed up for net zero targets, and everybody else. If you take existing technology and the rate of current innovation, we see we have got the technologies to electrify transport systems, to actually upgrade housing stock, etc. That is to make our supply chains more resilient. That is not the problem. The second thing is that financials are not the problem. If you actually look at the cost of investing in energy efficiency, renewable energy, decarbonizing supply chains, we see that most companies can hit the majority of their targets at a payback period that sits below 8 years. And I know that 8 years for a lot of organizations is a long period, but 8 years is also a timeline that you can actually understand and oversee, and it means it becomes a structuring problem rather than a financials problem. However, what we do see is that capital is the problem. And we've done a lot of work, both bottom-up and top-down, and just looked at how much capital is actually needed to hit Paris, which is a sentence that you should not take out of context in the way that I've written it down there. But basically, for the world to get to the Paris Agreement, we've actually estimated that you need between 80 and 120 trillion dollars. So let's, for argument's sake, say it's about 100 trillion dollars. And that needs to be deployed in the next 15 to 20 years in order to actually hit those targets. US being 25% of global GDP, more or less, that means you need the equivalent of an infrastructure bill every year for the next 15 years. And of course, we don't need to do it all with public sector money, but I'm just giving you that number just to give you an indication of the size of the challenge. So the capital that needs to be deployed is the biggest challenge that we have. And what is needed for that is that we take all the lessons learned from the past, add a whole load of innovation, and then start doing things differently. And there's a whole bunch of mistakes we shouldn't make. I mean, the world, not just the US, is littered with PPP projects that actually are not necessarily that successful and actually have led to a lot of problems. So it's not a matter of actually looking back what we've done in the past and doing it better. No, it's actually looking back at the past, learning about the mistakes we've made, and then do it better. And so what it means for private sector capital is that we need to innovate. I say we update the rule book, and it is like that, because if you look at infrastructure investment in green infrastructure, it's different ticket size, it's different business models, it's different risk profiles, it's different cost of capital. So the traditional way of investing in infrastructure does not work. I'm not saying it's not happening. Loads of organizations are innovating, but we need to do it at scale. We need to get to that $100 trillion, yeah? So the private sector really needs to innovate. Public sector capital, of which there is a lot, but it's limited, really needs to be focused on leveraging, on reducing risk, and on long term. Because one of the biggest problems with deploying this much capital early on or in a short period of time is that it will lead to increasing cost for end users, which is what you want to avoid at all costs, because we've already got cost of living crisis and social inequality issues. So what public sector capital really needs to be there to leverage private sector capital, to reduce the risk, and to focus on long term. An example of that is in the EU, in order to quickly become less dependent on Russian oil or gas, the latest instruments are 20-year loans that will be provided by the European Union, where the payback sits all in the last 5 years. And what that means is that you can have private sector capital being used to just do the normal stuff, looking at the normal risk reward, normal returns, etc. But actually a large chunk of the actual cost is pushed out. And that's how public sector capital can be used differently. And there will be a couple of other examples coming up as well. So just probably 2 examples of innovative solutions, and then I would like to give everybody some time for questions as well. So this is an example of let's call it a private sector fund that has used public sector capital. And I know this is not the most brilliant picture, but just to explain what we've done here. It's effectively a fund that is focused on community investments, where we're using, in this case it was public sector equity, which could easily be a guarantee or a long-term loan. We use private sector equity and we leverage it with debt. And what this fund did is invested in local EV charging infrastructure. It invested in electric vehicle fleets. It invested in the own building stock of the public sector organization. It built renewable energy, and it improved social housing. But the nice thing is that the returns on investment and all that are enough to then actually also use some of the, let's call it profits, to actually invest in infrastructure that does not lead to a return. For example, roads or village halls or upgrading churches. And by actually doing that, you can actually use the returns that sit in the commercial returns on EV charging infrastructure, EV fleets, building stock, etc., to actually also get to those communities that need investment that do not provide the return on investment. And the way that this is structured is actually really neat, because what we did is we set up a charity. These excess profits were given to that charity, and the charity then decided, together with the local community, where all those investments need to go into. And for me, this is an example of how you can actually take public sector capital, which you structure in a totally different way than traditionally is the case. You can actually lever private sector capital and do good in local communities. And for me, that's kind of an example. And this can be easily scaled up. And you can see the leverage level. It's about 20 million in, 100 million out from a public sector point of view. I think those things are really exciting. Possibly even more exciting than that is supply chains. We've already heard a lot about supply chains this morning. Yeah? One of the key problems with supply chains is that they're dispersed, they're in various different countries. Often suppliers have got no or low credit rating, and there's lots of them. Yeah? So we work with a couple of food and bev companies that have got 8,000 suppliers. Out of the 8,000, 100 are credit-worthy companies to invest in. So that means that 7,900 are not. And if you look at it from that point of view, you really need to come up with a solution how you decarbonize that supply chain in order to make that supply chain more resilient in a way that works. And that's actually really rather complex. So what we've come up with is a structure where we do that together with banks, we do this together with big brands, food and bev companies. We come up with a structure which almost looks like a fund. What that fund does is it actually invests in energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, let's say in India or Bangladesh. And let's say that the client is an American food and bev company. Yeah? And that money flows to India, Bangladesh. It is invested in energy efficient renewable energy. Payback periods are typically 5, 6, 7 years. It's leveraged with debt, so we can easily achieve those kind of returns. And then the brand gets repaid a return on investment because these are proper profitable projects. But the other thing they get is they get carbon credits. And why do they get carbon credits? Because those carbon credits prove that this brand has actually decarbonized their supply chain for those numbers of tons of CO2 that actually have been reduced. So what it actually means is a couple of things. One is a brand has got proof that they are decarbonizing their supply chain, and we've all heard this morning how difficult it is to actually look at greenhouse gas accounting in supply chains. One. Two is, you're doing a project, let's say in India, where actually a large chunk of the project finance stack is a dollar-denominated project finance stack with an A-rated brand as a counterpart. So that means that the cost of capital goes down a lot. And if you then layer in a bit of public sector guarantees, you actually end up with a cost of capital that means that you can set up these multi-billion-dollar facilities to actually reduce supply chain emissions. And those are the kind of things that we are working on, where I actually really think that we are really trying to outwit complexity. We don't have silver bullets, but we are really trying to get to the point where you come up with a lot of interesting, innovative stories to actually make real inroads into the problem. So what it also means, though, is, and this is probably one of my predictions, I think that because of the need for provenance of carbon credits in supply chains, as well as the important role that it plays in the project finance stack, I believe that carbon credits is currently on the road to developing into a multi-trillion-dollar market. And I think that's probably one of the biggest business opportunities there is actually getting your head around that and doing that right. So sometimes it feels that miracles are needed. But I think what we also try to show at the moment is that you can actually create those miracles. But you just do need to collaborate with, not just with your own firm. You need to work together with brands, with other brands, with your competitors, with financial players, etc., because that's the scale of the problem. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention and see if there's any questions.
Able to, well done. Thank you very much, Evelyn. Just because that's quite interesting in a kind of different direction from more in the detail there on supply chains and investment. Are there any questions we'd like to squidge in before we really do have a break, promise?
We've got one question here from Slido, which is, building back green will work only if there is a supply chain risk diversification, but the cost economics may not support it. How can one balance these aspects?
So I think the whole issue around supply chain risk diversification, there is a bit of so there's two different schools of thoughts when it comes to that. So one of them is that actually you can increase the resiliency of your supply chains by actually developing much longer term relationships with suppliers and developing a much more intimate relationship with those suppliers. You see some companies taking that route. The other option is exactly the one that was just posed in a question. Do you need to diversify? Do you need to diversify number of suppliers? Do you need to diversify countries? And do you need to diversify over time? And I think it's very much dependent on the type of supplier that it is. I mean, we did work for big brands where we looked at the resiliency of their supply chains within the context of agriculture and food products. And it does really make sense to diversify where you get your rice from because of physical climate risk, extreme weather events, etc., etc. So I think all in all, the key thing on that is to actually make sure that the facilities that you build, the structures that you build are flexible and agile. But keep in mind that really what you're trying to do is increase the resiliency of the supply chains rather than anything else. And sometimes that means you go one way, sometimes it means you go the other.